A new Halloween film has come and gone, which means that this franchise needs to be re-ranked. And I know it's November and Halloween Kills has been out for over a month now, but I couldn't just automatically come up with a new list. No, I needed to regroup, I needed to carefully study each film all over again. I take this sort of thing very seriously, I'll have you know. So in this video, I will be arbitrarily ranking every single Halloween film up to date, from the worst all the way to the best. Franchise spoilers to follow, obviously. What is up, Scream Team? Zach Cherry here, and if you're as obsessed with horror movies as I am, you might want to consider hitting that subscribe button and turning on those bell notifications, setting them to all. That way, you can stay up to date with all my latest content. As always, I'm going to remind you that this list reflects my own personal opinion and has only been made to inform you of where my enjoyment of the Halloween franchise lies. I know for a fact that most of you are going to disagree with me, and that's perfectly fine. I do welcome the contention, but at the end of the day, whether we see eye to eye or not, we're all united by the passion we share for these movies. So if you love the Halloween franchise, do me a favor and let me know by tossing this video a thumbs up, and maybe in the comments down below to let me know how you would personally rank all 12 films. Let's get into it. In last place, I have Halloween Resurrection. After finally killing Laurie Strode, who had been institutionalized after the events of H2O, Michael returns to his derelict childhood home in Haddonfield, which has now become the setting for a new internet reality series called Dangertainment. He murders most of the cast and crew, only to be thwarted by a martial arts trained rapper who zaps him in the dick with a live wire, subsequently burning the entire Halloween franchise into the ground. I don't want to dwell too much on these bottom entries because there really are only 3 Halloween movies I hate, but this one takes the cake because there really is no movie to be found here. If you break down any sort of plot, there's literally nothing that happens after the opening scene, just a lot of setups for ineffective jump scares. When I first saw this when it came out, I was very annoyed over the retcon of H2O's ending and Michael killing off Laurie so effortlessly, but as time goes on, I find there's other things about this film that are way more offensive. For starters, this is basically just a studio film. Miramax repurposed one of the many spec scripts they had lying around, which is something they did for all their straight-to-video Hellraiser sequels. From there, they probably had a bunch of executives sit in a room and write down on a drawing board in 2 columns, A, what do kids like these days, and B, how can we save as much money on this as possible? Basically coming up with reality television, rap music, supermodels, and found footage, which was then leveraged against single-setting locations filmed predominantly on handheld 360p resolution. I know this movie does have a small faction of devoted fans who appreciate it for its perceived camp value. I personally love camp, but I don't find this to be campy at all. It takes a lot of work to make something campy, and this movie was way too low effort in order to achieve that. In 11th place, I have Rob Zombie's Halloween 2. In the sequel to the remake, Laurie suffers PTSD while also sharing a psychic bond with Michael, in which he's visited by the spirit of their mother who walks around with a white horse because symbolism? Meanwhile, Loomis launches his latest book tour in which he exploits the victims of his former patient, all culminating with Laurie discovering she's related to Michael, who has also returned to Haddonfield after being a wandering hobo for the past 2 years. I mostly just find this to be a very unpleasant movie experience. I remember seeing it initially in the theaters and getting this underwhelming feeling, kind of like I had been in a long-term relationship with the Halloween franchise at that point, and it had finally dawned on me that it just wasn't working out anymore. I do place this above Resurrection because there is at least a semblance of a plot, and I actually really enjoyed the opening scene at the hospital, which of course just turns out to be a dream, but everything about this is just so heavy and devoid of fun. We've got Michael without his mask on for extended portions of the film, and then when he does wear it, you can see half of his face and the beard showing through. We've got maybe the most unlikable characters in the franchise, with the exception of Sheriff Brackett, because Brad Dourif is amazing in everything he does. At this point, I've pretty much accepted that this movie wasn't made for me. I acknowledge its existence, I respect its tenacity, but personally, I don't watch it anymore, even if I'm marathoning all the other movies, and that's saying something. In 10th place, I have Rob Zombie's Halloween. Following the remake trend of horror movies in the mid-2000s, Halloween retells the story of the night he came home, but with the added twist of an unconventional backstory that elaborates on Michael's childhood upbringing. Through the early years, we see the character's mental and emotional unraveling, the time he spends at Smith's Grove, and his evolution into the Shape, begging the question whether his evil was a result of nature or nurture. I'm not gonna sugarcoat this, I I am not a fan of Rob Zombie. If his sequel was the twisting of the knife into the flesh, this movie is the initial stab in the gut. I know he has his supporters within the Halloween community, and that's great. I love that this franchise has something for everybody, but again, his movies weren't made for me. I will say that I do prefer the theatrical cut, and I remember quite enjoying it the first time I saw it, but that could have also been due to the energy of the theater crowd at the time, and the fact that we finally had Michael back on the screen after the letdown that was Resurrection. In terms of this being a remake, I think it fares better than most because something different was actually done here, but at the same time, the backstory kind of takes away the allure of the character, and all of the present day stuff I find to be such a slog, especially the final girl chase scene depicted in the last 15 minutes of the film, which just drags on for what seems like days. In ninth place, I have Halloween Kills. After a botched attempt to kill Michael in a flaming death trap, Laurie is taken to Haddonfield Memorial Hospital while Tommy Doyle, the little kid from the very first movie, organizes a militia of angry townspeople to hunt down the killer. Meanwhile, Deputy Hawkins survives his injuries from the previous film and recalls back to Halloween night of 1978 when he prevented Dr. Loomis from killing Michael, thus allowing for the current massacre to take place 40 years later. A lot of people have been curious to know how I feel about Halloween Kills, as I haven't exactly pontificated about it since its release. I do, however, want to preface this by reminding everyone how a ranking works, because there are always a few of you, not everyone, who have this misconception where, for example, if I say I prefer apples to oranges, you interpret that to mean that I hate oranges altogether. Yes, I have this movie in ninth place. No, I don't hate it, but I do have notes. And like I said, there are only 3 movies in this franchise that I don't like, and I've already talked about them, so don't be assuming shit. I was very keen on this movie. I thought it started off on a series high, which might actually be my favorite opening of any of the films. With the exception of the Loomis voice actor, the flashback was immaculate. The Myers house, the mask, the color grading, the overall tone, even the physical appearance of Loomis was all uncanny to the original. As we moved along, I thought the scene transitions were well done, the music was fantastic. I just liked how everything was being set up for a really great merging of all these storylines and characters, but then it never happened. The entire movie got to this point, probably within the first third, where it pivoted in an entirely different direction, which I don't think was for the better, and we never came back from it. I have watched this a few times now, and while initially I think my issues were kind of petty and more so latched onto trivial aspects like the cringeworthy dialogue and illogical choices made by its characters, I am now looking at Halloween Kills in a much broader sense, where I can sum up my dissatisfaction with only 2 major gripes. Firstly, I'm a huge proponent for character. I think that at the core of any great movie is the subtext of the human condition, and the plot and everything else is just decorative finishes that accentuate that. Of course, these are just Halloween sequels, so my expectations don't run deep, but at the very least, there should be one main character whose experience we primarily follow, and we don't have that here. Laurie is completely sidelined for most of the movie and only turns up to monologue this pretentious rhetoric. We don't spend enough time with Karen, Allison, or Tommy to really justify this as their movie either, so the entire narrative comes off as very unstructured. The second issue I have is that there's not a great deal of horror to be found here. That's not to say that there aren't moments of horror, but I feel that they're either never punctuated properly or quickly undermined by a comedic or melodramatic beat, and in a lot of other cases, a poorly timed edit. I think a really good example of this is when Lindsay is being chased by the Shape, which is by far one of my favorite moments of the film because it seems like we're building up to something horrific that's meant to scare us, but then the scene just ends and we jump over to another scene entirely without really getting any sort of payoff to that escalating tension. Based on the editing here, it's clear to see that there was probably more to Lindsay and Michael's altercation, but the only justification for that being cut out of the finished film would be that the producers weren't satisfied with the way the scene turned out. Overall, I think the good does outweigh the bad. This is just not one that I'm probably going to revisit as often. Having said that, I'm still happy that there are a lot of people who love Halloween Kills because the fact that this franchise is doing so well right now is a good indicator that we're going to be getting a lot more horror movies to watch in the near future, whether it be other franchises getting rebooted or new IP altogether. In 8th place, I have Halloween 2018. Ignoring the events of every Halloween after the original, Halloween 2018 picks up 40 years later with Michael having been reinstitutionalized and Laurie becoming an unstable survivalist who has alienated her entire family. During a routine inmate transfer, Michael escapes and returns to Haddonfield, where with the help of his new doctor, is brought back to Laurie, who sets a trap in an attempt to kill him once and for all. An interesting thing I've noticed about this film and Halloween Kills is that people who love this movie seem to hate that one, and people who hate this movie seem to love that one. I'm pretty much split on both of them myself. I think that the problems I have with Halloween Kills were already prevalent here, for instance the mishandled direction, but I also think that both films share a lot of the same achievements in terms of their technical aspects and production quality. I do favor this movie a little bit more because I like that Laurie at least receives some sort of catharsis by the end. I don't necessarily like how she gets there, since the trajectory was a result of plot contrivances that were outside of her control and knowledge. For example, the podcasters and Dr. Sartain basically giving Michael all the tools he needed and chaperoning him along the way, but I've also come to be more relaxed about these flaws since I think that the ends do justify the means. This is definitely one of the best looking and sounding Halloween films. It certainly captures an aesthetic consistency with John Carpenter's original, especially in terms of Michael Myers and his mask and James Jude Courtney's performance. I often contrast this movie with H2O because for every reason that I think that movie is Laurie's true Halloween anniversary, I feel the same thing applies to 2018 in that this is Michael's true Halloween anniversary, just for how true to the character he is. In that regard, this movie is a resounding success. However, I liken it to the same way Stephen King likens Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of The Shining, in that I think Halloween 2018 is a big, beautiful Cadillac with no engine inside it. Ultimately, this movie is alright to me. I think it does a serviceable job. I'm just more inclined to revisit the classic entries instead, as I find they encapsulate more of what it is that I enjoy about this franchise. In 7th place, I have Halloween 4: The Return of Michael Myers. 10 years after getting burnt to a crisp and falling into a coma, Michael wakes up and escapes custody during another routine transfer on the night before Halloween. Dr. Loomis, who also survived his previous injuries, follows his patient back to Haddonfield, where he discovers Michael plans to murder his 8-year-old niece Jamie Lloyd, as she is now his only living blood relative. Halloween 4 is one that I watched a lot of as a kid and have many fond memories of. Overall, this to me is a very watchable movie. It might actually be the easiest movie of the franchise to watch, mostly due to the fact that it is very basic. That's neither a positive or a negative, as I do find this to be very middle of the road, but at the same time, while every other Halloween film has some sort of unique quality that makes it stand out on its own, this one is more or less just a low-grade retread of the original. This is evident in the decision to move away from the widescreen anamorphic format we saw in the first 3 movies to have more of a traditional 185 aspect ratio. It gives this movie more of a made-for-television vibe that, despite its attempts, is mostly devoid of the atmosphere that had originally been created through Dean Cundey's masterful cinematography. And while nowadays I mostly find this entry to be a little dull, I would argue that it does have the best ensemble of characters in the franchise, as most of them feel like real people who are appropriately reacting to the horrifying nature of their predicament. There's also some really great set pieces and kills in Halloween 4. For example, the entire sequence where everyone is locked inside the Meeker house with Michael, as well as his ability to rip through human flesh using nothing but his own brute force. Other than the technical stuff and Michael's mask, original or otherwise, I don't think that this movie really has all that many flaws, since it does play it relatively safe. But I guess if there is one story thing to comment on, it's that this movie is kind of responsible for perpetuating the mythology of Michael needing to kill off his bloodline. This was an idea that was obviously introduced in Halloween 2, but this movie could have gone in so many different directions rather than follow the brother-sister storyline, so they really did pigeonhole themselves from this point until the most recently rebooted timeline by giving Michael this one very specific agenda. For what it's worth though, I think this was the right movie to come out at the right time, no matter how vanilla I find it to be. Otherwise, it it might not have been successful enough to warrant 7 more sequels, a remake and a remake sequel. So credit where credit is due, Halloween 4 did save the franchise from disappearing into obscurity. In 6th place, I have Halloween: The Curse of Michael Myers. 6 years after being kidnapped by the Thorn Cult, Jamie escapes their clutches with her newborn baby, only for Michael to quickly track her down and murder her. The baby, however, is rescued by a now adult Tommy Doyle, who believes Michael is being governed by a mystical rune, while Laurie Strode's adoptive relatives move into the Myers house unaware of its murderous past. So I know this movie is hated by most Halloween fans, and I would never debate anyone putting it towards the back of their rankings because it obviously does have a lot of flaws, primarily in respect to its story and all the cult nonsense. It was also very disrespectful to the character of Jamie, but in all fairness to that particular death, most of these movies do follow a pattern of killing off a surviving character from the previous movie. I mentioned in my ranking from last year that this was the first Halloween movie I ever saw, and if I'm being completely honest, I did kind of hate The Curse of Michael Myers for the longest time, so I do agree with most of the criticisms about it, but in recent years, and with the advent of Resurrection and Rob Zombie's remake timeline, I've come to recognize Curse as the most underrated entry in the franchise because despite its flaws, it's still very interesting and unique. And when you compare that to, say, the Friday the 13th franchise, which for as much as I love that franchise too, I think it's inferior to Halloween because most of the movies do tend to be very repetitious. So in that regard, I appreciate the change of pace that The Curse of Michael Myers has to offer. I don't need to see the same Halloween movie over and over again, and I think that this franchise is really good for offering us that variety. Obviously, for the sake of this ranking, I am referring to the theatrical cut, which makes even less sense than the producer's cut, as the film did undergo many reshoots for its finale, mostly leaving an incoherent mess by the last frame. But if we are comparing the two, I do prefer the theatrical just because I don't like the idea that Michael can be controlled by any sort of Samhain ritual. I also personally find that out of all the movies, this one features Michael at his scariest. He just seems way more intimidating here, and it wasn't achieved by being a 7-foot behemoth wrestler. He just displayed the right amount of brutality while still maintaining his playfulness and mystique. I also really enjoy this movie visually. I think the cinematography is vastly overlooked, which is another component as to why I find this one scarier. It has some of my favorite kills of the franchise, plus I think they did a much better job of the mask in this. And lastly, I kind of love that this movie stars Paul Rudd in probably one of his most awkward performances in all of its twitchy, mentally unhinged glory. So for all those reasons and more, I do find myself revisiting this one more often than not. In 5th place, I have Halloween 5: The Revenge of Michael Myers. 1 year after violently attacking her foster mother, Jamie has been placed in a children's clinic where she's now been rendered mute while sharing a telepathic connection with Michael. Realizing his former patient is still alive and coming back to murder his young niece, Dr. Loomis sets a trap in the old Myers house using Jamie as bait, but things get complicated as a mysterious visitor arrives in Haddonfield with his own sinister agenda. The problem with Halloween 5 and why it's hated by a large majority of the fan community is that people have been viewing this as a horror movie. You can't view Halloween 5 as a horror movie. It's a terrible horror movie. But as a comedy, Halloween 5 is pure gold. Not only is this among one of my favorite camp classics of the horror genre, but it's also my guiltiest pleasure of guilty pleasures. I'm not even sure I can classify it as a guilty pleasure though, because I am quite proud of my allegiance towards it. I find the production of this movie to be fascinating because there really was no rhyme or reason in anything that was going on other than a lot of overzealous decision making. Halloween 5 was helmed by a Swiss-French director named Dominique Othenin-Girard, who basically convinced Mustafa Akkad to hand the franchise over to him so he could do whatever he pleased with it. Obviously, in hindsight, Akkad regretted that decision, but knowing how protective he was of the franchise at that point, this guy must have been a sorcerer or something to pull that off. The whole film was basically made up as they went along. It has this very European art house vibe to it, since the director didn't exactly have his finger on the pulse of North American cinema. So because of that, all the characters in this come off as extreme exaggerations, because that's how he perceived 1980s American culture, and it all just clashes horribly with this pervasive gothic style. And because there are so many different genres and subgenres infused introduced here. Each one individually fails, but as a whole, it becomes a masterclass in filmmaking on how to unintentionally craft a horror camp classic. So since I am ranking these based solely on my own personal enjoyment and not necessarily on the overall quality, I will say that I don't think this is a good movie in any way, shape, or form. It's just a lot of fun, and I'm kind of obsessed with its badness. Having said that, however, I do think it deserves praise for certain things like the laundry chute set piece, Michael's versatile arsenal of weaponry, and Donald Pleasance's over-the-top performance, because he was just giving it his all in this one. In fourth place, I have Halloween H2O. 20 years after her brother's body disappeared from the fire at Haddonfield Memorial Hospital, Laurie has gone into hiding with her teenaged son, John, where she copes with life through the use of prescription drugs and copious amounts of alcohol. Michael tracks her down to a private school in Northern California at which she teaches, where Laurie decides it's time to stop running from her past and finally confront her demons head on. H2O is a very entertaining movie to me, but as a Halloween movie, I find it to be a little lackluster in a sense that it doesn't really feel like a Halloween movie. Obviously, this is an effect of Scream having been released a year and a half earlier, influencing much of the landscape of horror movies in the late 90s. It definitely worked better at the time because I don't think H2O is as good as I remember it to be, but like most of these movies, the good does outweigh the bad. I mostly enjoy this one and rank it a lot higher because I think this is Jamie Lee Curtis's best performance across the franchise. She just seems like she's having the most fun here. That's probably due to the fact that the basis for this movie was her idea, and she felt really passionate about giving the fans a great concluding chapter. Obviously, the producers had their own agenda, which wasn't in line with hers, and that's why we got the retcon opening in Resurrection, but for a lot of us, at least until Halloween Ends comes out, this is the true final battle between Laurie and Michael. Like I was saying earlier with my notes on Halloween 2018, I think Laurie is written much better here. She has a more consistent through line, her evolution over the years just feels more authentic, but while the story and character are, in my opinion, superior to most of the movies here, it's from a production standpoint where H2O really falls flat. We see this mostly in the way that Michael is presented to us, where everything about him is just wrong, from his movements and agility right down to the mask, of which there were 4 used in total, one being CGI. The aesthetic of the movie also reaches more into Scream than Halloween, really channeling those WB teen horror vibes, and the score has even been replaced by the exact same music used in Scream. It's a little distracting to say the least. Fortunately, I do really love Scream, so they could have done much worse when finding a popular movie to emulate, but for me, these issues are what holds H2O back and marks the separation of a good Halloween film from a great Halloween film, as the next 3 movies above this one are all, in my opinion, god tier. So with that said, in third place, I have Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. After a patient of his is violently killed in the hospital as part of an apparent murder-suicide, Dr. Dan Chalice teams up with the man's daughter in order to search for answers. Their investigation leads them to a small town run by a mysterious toy maker, where they discover a sinister plot to murder all the children of the world using Halloween masks that are mystically powered by Stonehenge. Apologies in advance if this comes off as more of a ranting than a ranking, but it seems like a lot of people look at Season of the Witch and feel as though it gives the Halloween franchise a bad name. I think it's the other way around. I think that the Halloween franchise has been holding Season of the Witch back, because this movie is like that kid in high school that nobody liked, but then graduated and became really successful and good looking, while the other Halloween movies basically peaked very early on. And not to be controversial, but when it comes down to it, I'm more of a John Carpenter fan than I am a Michael Myers fan. Despite this being a movie where Carpenter is only credited as a producer and musician, it's a well-known fact that he was there every step of the way, doing uncredited rewrites on the screenplay and assembling his crew of creative talent. So because of that, this to me feels like the most Carpenter-esque sequel out of the entire franchise, and it's really a shame that people are still sleeping on it for for the sole purpose that Michael Myers is not physically present in it. If this movie had dropped the Halloween 3 from its title, it would have been insanely popular at the time and even more so respected today. Sure, the story is weird, but I like weird. I'm a weird guy. Weird horror movies are the backbone of this genre and built it into what it is today. This movie also has really great kills, it's photographed exceptionally well, has one of the greatest horror movie scores of all time, it's got Tom freaking Atkins in it. Just a really far out there, really underappreciated classic piece of horror movie cinema. In second place, I have Halloween 2. Following Michael's attack on Laurie Strode and subsequent disappearance, he follows her to Haddonfield Memorial over the course of the same night, where he kills off the hospital staff in order to get to her. Meanwhile, Dr. Loomis continues his search all over town, where he inadvertently kills drunk teenagers, mispronounces Celtic words, and discovers the true reason why Michael came home. The reason why I love this movie so much is because it is oozing with atmosphere. The hospital setting is such a creepy environment for a horror movie, and it's almost a character in and of itself. There's also some great kills thrown in the mix, Loomis being even more of a badass, but mostly I find this to be a very well-made companion piece to the original, as it employs a consistent cinematic style which blends the movies together into a pretty seamless two-parter. John Carpenter, who wrote the script and directed numerous reshoots, did famously call this film an abomination a few years after it was released, and I will agree that it's not without its flaws, but I think he may have been a tad bit hyperbolic, or at least didn't have the foresight to know how far his legacy would go. Among the problems, and similar to Halloween Kills, there are some weirdly timed edits. Laurie is also sidelined for most of the film, arguably losing all of that final girl ingenuity that was kind of her trademark throughout the original. However, she's still in the thick of it here, and does at least get to have a confrontation with Michael, which does instigate one of my favorite chase sequences ever, even if Dick Warlock as the Shape only ever moves with the speed and intensity of molasses. But despite its criticism, especially in regard to being nothing more than a generic slasher that was made from the impetus of cashing in on the movies that copied Halloween to begin with, I gotta say, it's still a pretty damn good sequel. In first place, I have Halloween. 15 years after murdering his older sister at the age of 6, Michael Myers escapes from the mental institution where he returns to his hometown. Setting his sights on a group of babysitters, he stalks and murders them one by one until Laurie Strode is the last one remaining, all the while as his psychiatrist Dr. Loomis frantically combs the streets looking for him. This probably isn't a surprise to anyone because Halloween is pretty much a perfect movie to me, so I'm gonna keep this short and sweet. I find that while every subsequent Halloween sequel or remake has aged since it's been released, some for the better, others for the worst, the original has always stayed exactly the same, and that's a true testament to the quality of John Carpenter and Deborah Hill's work, as well as the guerrilla-style filmmaking they used to achieve it. While thousands of producers have tried and failed to replicate this magic, those two knew exactly what it was they were making at the time, and were only ever gonna make the best version of it. Halloween is an unprecedented masterpiece through and through, and is among one of my favorite films of all time, horror or otherwise. I want to thank my Patreon supporter Joe Sinecuas. If you guys want to check out even more Halloween related content or other horror franchise rankings, you can click on either one of these playlists. Until next time, I've been Zach Cherry, and I'll be right back.